Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to begin by recognizing that I am living, working, and streaming to you today in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I say this acknowledging it as both an honor and a responsibility. We are all treaty people. Many of you here, including our presenters and facilitators, are also living on the ancestral territory of the various original people of this land. And I encourage you to acknowledge in the chat where you are streaming from today. Bonjour à toutes et tous et merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Je vais commencer par reconnaître que je vis et travaille aujourd'hui à Mi'kmaq, le territoire ancestral non cédé du peuple Mi'kmaq. Je dis cela en reconnaissant que c'est à la fois un honneur et une responsabilité. Nous sommes tous des personnes signataires de cette traité. Plusieurs d'entre vous, incluant nos animateurs et hôtes, vivent également sur le territoire ancestral de divers peuples originaires de cette terre. Je vous encourage à reconnaître dans le clavardage Zoom d'où vous êtes aujourd'hui. Thank you, everyone. My name is Lydia Vermaiden. I am the Alliance Training Specialist and a member of the sort of honorary member of the Alliance RDM team, supportive member. The session today will be recorded. Please stay muted unless you're asking a question. We'll be taking on-mic questions at the end. If you have one, please use the raise hand button in the reactions menu. Then you'll be invited to ask your question on mic. During the session, you can put your questions in the Zoom chat. For the session, you are asked to invited to ask your questions in English in response to content. But if you have technical questions, please, or if you have technical issues, you can place your questions in the chat in French or English. Mon nom est Lydia Vermaiden, je suis la spécialiste de formation pour l'Alliance, une membre en heure pour l'équipe de l'Alliance RDM. Cet atelier aujourd'hui est enregistré. Maintenant, fermez votre microphone, s'il vous plaît. Il y aura une période de questions de vive voix à la fin de l'atelier. Si vous avez une question, cliquez sur réaction là-bas en inférieur dans la fenêtre Zoom. Puis levez la main et entendez que vous invite à parler. À tout moment, vous pouvez vos questions par écrit dans l'espèce de clavardage Zoom. Posez vos questions en anglais pour cette séance, s'il vous plaît. Merci pour votre présence aujourd'hui. Thank you, everyone. I would now like to introduce to you our presenter for the day, today, Kevin Reed. Kevin is the Associate Librarian, Health Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. He has been offering research data management or RDM training and support over the last 10 years, specifically in academic health centers. Before coming to the University of Saskatchewan, he was an associate fellow at the National Institutes of Health in the US and then worked at NYU Langone Health, where he helped lead the development of a data services program for the institution. Since returning to Canada, he has taken on leadership opportunities within the Digital Research Alliance of Canada's RDM community, where he chairs two groups that are focused on improving the discovery of research data in Canada. His research focuses on improving research data discovery in Canada and implementing RDM and open science education in undergraduate and graduate programs. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. So today I'm really going to talk to you about some of the work from one of the working groups within the Alliance to really get a sense of what are some of the challenges that researchers face when finding it and accessing restricted data in Canada. So before I start, I'd just like to give a land acknowledgement. I am currently living and working in Saskatoon, which is Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis, and I pay respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place. And in my role, specifically around data, I commit to allyship and partnership with those who come before me and feel very fortunate that the communities here have been supportive of that relationship going forward. So what I want to start off with is really starting with a baseline of what do we mean by when we're talking about restricted data. For the purposes of our work, restricted data is that which are not immediately accessible because they are either restricted or only available upon requests. And so when we think about restricted data, some examples might be licensed data, whether commercially or through an organization, or restricted data because of legal issues or potentially protected health information. And so just so we have a good sense of what we mean when we're looking at restricted data in a Canadian context that would be available online, here we have an example of the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. We have data that is available for research. However, in order to access this data, you need to go through a series of application processes and you need to fit a series of criteria. And this is the type of data that we were looking to explore in the work that we were doing as part of this working group. So before I get into what the work is that we started to do, I really want to address what the discovery and access problem has been to date and what we've seen in the research. And so when we look at research specifically, the first issue is around finding data like this, finding restricted data. So research has indicated that the ability to search for restricted data through individual data sources is either difficult or non-existent. So the actual search functionality within data sources is often absent. We also know that researchers struggle to discern whether or not restricted data can actually be used for research purposes. They don't know whether or not they can use it and therefore have difficulty deciding whether or not to pursue a data set in the first place. And then the third, and probably one of the more challenging aspects, is that because of the discovery issue, researchers are often unaware that restricted data exists at all. So they don't know that it exists and therefore don't necessarily pursue research questions that could help answer those questions. We also know that reporting from the research community when they publish on research where they've used restricted data is pretty poor. So this is a study that we conducted about a couple of years ago where we looked at data availability statements funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And what we found is that when anyone had an application that was required, there was no sufficient description or indication of metadata that would outline what someone would have to do in order to gain access to a restricted data set. And so not only are we seeing issues in discovery from the data source perspective, but researchers aren't necessarily reporting on the fact that this restricted data is available and how you would actually gain access to it. We then come to the issue is that once you actually find a data set, accessing that data is an entirely different issue. So what research has shown is that oftentimes researchers are uncertain about whether or not they're actually eligible to access data sets. They have difficulties both in understanding and navigating the application process. This can often be quite cumbersome. There's a lack of standardization about how to submit a data request across data sources. So if you're trying to pool secondary data from multiple places, often you're going on your own little adventure in each data source in order to figure out how to access that data. Oftentimes, the amount of time it takes to apply and acquire restricted data is prohibitive and can be an impediment to research. It takes too much time to do it, and therefore researchers don't end up pursuing a data set because of that. And ultimately, a lot of data sources do not provide adequate support to help someone navigate the process. And this might not be because they don't want to, but it may be because they're lacking resources in some ways. And I just wanted to pull this quote from Lug and Widger et al., which really talks about the challenge and articulates it quite nicely, in that the reuse of restricted data requires a set of complex approvals from multiple governing entities, which are often opaque, difficult to navigate and obtain, and so pose risks to population-based research. So the access process is a barrier, and oftentimes there's a lot of uncertainty for researchers in actually figuring out whether they can access it or not. Then, when it comes to them actually acquiring the data, we also know that research indicates that restricted data is often poor quality. It's not maintained, it can be poorly organized, data quality is low, and it lacks standardization. And oftentimes there's not enough documentation necessary to facilitate the reuse of that data. So at every level, whether it's finding data, trying to access it, or actually acquiring that data, we're seeing challenges on the restricted side because of the lack of support in this area. And so because of this, these barriers to access and to discovery, they have consequences. Research has shown that researchers limit their research questions to data that they can easily find and obtain. So if it's too hard for them to get, they're not going to necessarily open up their research to new questions that maybe allow them to explore different outcomes. Researchers also may invest a substantial amount of time and resources into acquiring data that cannot be easily accessed or acquired or ultimately used. And ultimately, we've seen that academic and non-academic research is limited when restricted data does not provide a means to make data easily discoverable and or accessible. So we're seeing a lot of challenges here being reported in the literature simply because people can't access and discover this data. So in terms of why this matters and why our group potentially took this work on is that the Canadian data sharing landscape, I think, does a pretty great job of supporting discovery and access of open data, but it doesn't necessarily pursue this with restricted data in the same way. And we know that restricted data can have tremendous value, for example, in health research when we're looking at different health outcomes, but because it's not optimized for discovery, accessibility, and reuse, we're seeing potentially challenges and barriers to people accessing it and using this data. And so in terms of addressing this problem, a national working group was formed about 2 years ago called the Access Limited Data Discovering Working Group. And this is operating under the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. And when we talk about access limited data, we're really defining it broader than what we would think of as restricted data. So when we first formed this group, the idea of access limited data was anytime you might find a data source that had data that was difficult to find or understand. So restricted data falls under that category, but we were also looking at potential sites that were under-resourced and had spreadsheets you could download with no metadata or no description. And so the goals of this working group were to, one, scope the landscape to really figure out what type of access limited data sources are out there. What are the challenges associated with these data sources in terms of discovery and access? And what recommendations can we make based on what we find to help improve the discovery of access of this data? And so our working group membership is formed of quite a few people, both within academic institutions as well as national restricted data sources like the CRDCN, as well as the National Research Council. We also have membership from DataCite, and we've all been working together for about 2 years now, trying to tackle this problem. And so from these particular goals that we outlined for our working group, we developed 3 research questions that we needed to answer. So what types of Canadian access limited data sources exist that include data sets that could be used for research purposes? So what is the full landscape of Canadian access limited data? The second question is, how well do a sample of restricted health data sources in Canada make their data discoverable and accessible? And finally, what are the challenges associated with discovering and accessing data from that sample? So really both trying to get a full scope of the landscape while also evaluating a certain subset of these sources. So our first approach was to scope Canadian data sources altogether. So we identified as many access limited Canadian data sources as we could find, and we reviewed Canadian data sources like the CRDCN, like Scholars Portal. We looked at university and college and academic partnership websites, government websites. We also requested submissions from the Alliance RDN expert groups and made rounds on the CanLib data listserv. So anything that fit a restricted or access limited criteria, we wanted to find it. And then once we did, we captured as much information as we could about it, specifically the geographic region, what type of sector that data fell into, and what was the disciplinary focus. And from that, what we were able to create was an access limited data source inventory. And from our preliminary review, every single one of us went out and explored these different sources by province, and we were able to identify 137 total, ranging from every sector as well as discipline, specific to Canadian data sources. If you're at all interested in the data, we've actually published the data set in this inventory online, and it's available through the link in this page if people are interested in exploring it. So that was the first stage, is we got a sense of here's everything we could find in Canada related to this inventory. The second step of this was to pull out a subset and actually grade specific types of data sources. So in our sample of 137, we identified 55 health data sources in our inventory, which made up the largest representative sample of data sources. 48 of them were eligible to review. 4 of them were excluded because they only permitted patient data requests and therefore could not be used for research. And 3 of them actually became inaccessible over the course of us doing our review. So either it was a study project that closed or an organizational site that lost funding. So we weren't able to access those. And each source essentially was reviewed qualitatively to allow us to identify what are the most common attributes that make up these types of data sources. So the attributes that we identified were both on the side of discovery and the side of access. So on the discovery side, we looked at data description, data documentation, searchability and browsability, and the use of metadata standards as key attributes for discovery in these restricted data sources. On the access side, we thought the data request process, data restrictions, pricing information, and contact information were the most common attributes we identified on the access side. And so what we did is we scoped these out to make sure that we set ourselves a focus for each of these. And so here you can see on this slide, each attribute and its corresponding definition that allowed us to make sure we had a focus on how we were going to evaluate these. And then based on each attribute, what we did was we developed a grading scheme for each of them. So for data description, documentation, searchability, and browsability, and metadata, how well did these data sources do that? And then same on the access side, we looked at the data request process, data restrictions, pricing information, and contact information. And so what we did was with the 48 health data sources we had 2 reviewers in our group review each source. So the same 2 people reviewed a single data source. And if there were any discrepancies, we had a tiebreaker, which was myself, who reviewed it for the 3rd time to make the final grading scheme. And so the goals of this was to first evaluate the state of discovery and access in these health data sources. So how well are they making the data discoverable and accessible? To identify gaps and areas for improvement. We also saw this as an opportunity to say, hey, if we found data sources that are doing a really great job of this already, maybe we could prioritize them so they could be indexed into national aggregators, for example, like the Federated Research Data Repository. And then finally, these goals allowed us to inform our final recommendations. So what I'd like to do is go through how we graded each of these, so just to give you a sense and a flavor of how we approach the grading exercise. So if you're interested in the grading criteria after I'm finished, we also have made that available online. And a lot of institutions have actually reached out to us to use this already to help them evaluate a specific data set for their project as well. So that link is available in this slide and every following slide as well. So for data description, a grade A, which is the highest grade, would be that a data source would provide descriptions of the data that supports understanding for a broad audience. It would describe who was responsible for creating the data and describe the data's intended use or purpose. A grade B would be a description of the data that requires more information to facilitate a full understanding for selection and reuse. And grade C would mean there was little or no detail about the data whatsoever, or we didn't know who was responsible for it, or we weren't clear on the data's intended use or purpose. In terms of documentation, we were looking at an A grade would be data sets were accompanied by multiple pieces of detailed documentation that would help facilitate the reuse of the data. So everything from data dictionaries, code books, user guides, code, data collection materials, or instruments. A B grade would be, it includes some information, but we made our best guess as to potentially there wasn't enough information here to warrant an A grade. And finally, a C grade, again, was the absence of documentation or very limited documentation. For searchability and browsability, a grade A would be data sets are searchable within the data source. There's a basic keyword search. There's a mechanism to browse data sets by one or more relevant facets. There's an advanced interface that allows for Boolean searching. So that would give a grade A to the source. A B grade would be data sets are searchable and maybe there's a basic keyword search. And a grade C was there was no mechanism to search or browse by the data source. One thing to mention here is that not all data sources that we identified had more than one data set. So some of them only included access to a single data set. And when that happened, we marked that as not applicable for this case, and we did not grade it in this category. We then looked at metadata standards. So an A grade being it had structured metadata using a recognizable standard. There were core metadata elements and they were clearly presented. Whereas all the way down to a C grade was there was an absence of metadata altogether, or very, very little. Switching to the access side, this is where we were looking at how well does a data source describe their data request processes? So a grade A would be it clearly explains all aspects of the request process, and including the application forms, instructions on how to apply, timelines for approval, the review process and what that looks like, as well as the submission process. And there would also be someone there to support a researcher to submit a data access request. A B grade would be it clearly explains some of the aspects, and a grade C was there were no clear instructions whatsoever, or there was not even a data request form. In terms of restrictions, this was the idea that a source should indicate who is eligible to access the data. And if that wasn't the case, it was either provided a C grade, whereas in a B grade situation, what happened often is that there would be a restrictions placed or indicated, but there would be no indication of who those restrictions would apply to. So here you can see in our A grade, we have a few examples of specificity that would allow people to understand, hey, am I eligible to access this data? From a pricing perspective, we wanted to see in an A grade that fees are clearly explained and there's enough information to estimate the cost of a specific request. And if there was a quote process in place, the researcher should be able to submit a basic research plan, contact someone for help, and see a sample project with fees applied. Whereas a B grade might be, there's clear that there are fees and there are costs provided, but it's not quite to the level of detail of an A. And then in the grade C, that no information on fees was provided whatsoever. And then finally, we have contact information. So we wanted to make sure that a data source had clear, easy to find contact people with an email address devoted to them for data inquiries or application requests. We also wanted to see that contact information was displayed in the area where the data exists. That might seem obvious, but oftentimes this was not the case. We also saw that contact information on a B grade might be related to the application process. And finally, again, a grade C is either no information was provided or there was only a generic contact us tool provided. So you weren't necessarily who you were talking to or what they could respond to, but there might be that information there anyways. So full overview of a way to evaluate how well these data sources make their data discoverable, as well as on the accessibility side, how well and how clear are the guidelines for applying for this data in the first place. So taking now a look at some of the results, I want to first start with our inventory just to give you a sense of the makeup of the Canadian Access Limited data landscape. So the first thing we collected was of all of the 137 we found, where were they coming from? And so we saw about 50% of these were national in scope. However, you'll see that in terms of the distribution of the other provinces and territories, that again, Ontario and British Columbia sort of being a much larger place, you see a lot more representative data sources coming from there with a relatively even distribution beyond that for the rest of the provinces and territories. When we look at sector, the bulk of what we found were government data sources, followed by academic, and then there were private and nonprofit, and 13%, which fell into a category that really didn't fit any of these categories, and I think are worth exploring a little bit further. And then in terms of discipline, as I mentioned before, we looked at health data sources first because they were our largest sample, so about almost 42% on this one side. We also saw general purpose, natural sciences, and then you can see the makeup of the rest, which were social sciences, engineering, and technology. When it came to the actual grading of our health data sources, you can see the distribution of how well they did on the discovery side. So you can see a lot of red here, which were C grades, but also that some resources and data sources did quite well in data description specifically, meaning that they actually provided a fairly sufficient description of their data sets going forward. Also, if you're interested in the underlying data and the grading, that also is available through the link available on the slide if you're interested. Also, please note, and I'm going to talk about this quite a bit more in a bit, but in terms of metadata standards, not a single data source received an A grade, and 38 of the 48 sources received a C grade in this category, meaning they were either completely absent of metadata or there was very little at all. In terms of the access side of things, again, we saw the data request process being relatively well described, with most of the categories receiving A or B grades. However, when it came to data restrictions and pricing information, there was a lot of lack of clarity and opaqueness in terms of instructions around how much these data sets cost and who would potentially be eligible for them. So here again, you can see a nice distribution of how well they did in each category. For us, some of the key takeaways, specifically because we were looking at gaps and where potentially there is room for improvement in this area, we found that 42% of the data sources overall did not receive an A grade in any category whatsoever. Over 50% did not provide any information about data restrictions, so we couldn't tell whether or not we would be eligible or who would be eligible at all to access the data within some of these individual data sources. 56% did not provide any data documentation to support interoperability and or reuse. 79% received a C grade for metadata standards, and 0% received an A grade for metadata standards. So a lot of room for improvement in these areas, specifically metadata, because we didn't see necessarily a lot of detail or improvement in that area. However, it's not all bad. We want to make sure that we also identified some really great sources that did an excellent job of describing their data as well as the access process. And so here what we did was we did a simple ranking based on how many received the most A grades and then B grades followed by C grades. And these 11 sources that you see on this page, we think are excellent candidates for being indexed. Obviously, they did not receive a high score in terms of metadata, but they have all of the makeup of sufficient description and access that could easily be turned into and transformed into metadata. So they can be accessed through something like Further or through Dataverses respective to individual institutions. So we see a lot of promise in these particular data sources as a way forward for making them more discoverable and accessible. So what I want to do now is really highlight some of the key barriers and recommendations that we came up with based on what we found in this exercise based on the grading criteria. So the first challenge we found just by simply exploring these data sources was insufficient infrastructure. And I'm showing you a picture of a maze on the right-hand side here because that's really what it felt like when we were trying to navigate these sources and explore the data sets and trying to find the access information associated with them. And so some of the key barriers we identified here was that general navigation, workflows for accessing data, and linkage between the data sets and the access information was extremely challenging. We often found that where the data sets lived and the access request information were totally separate, and we had to move to different pages or download multiple forms in order to access them. And so it became very difficult for us to understand how these access requests applied to individual data sets. Generally, the time investment for us in seeking and learning about the data sets and their instructions was very, very high. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what these data sets were and how to acquire them. Generally, there was also a complete lack of standardization and high variability in each data source. So some had very smooth and easy to follow guidelines, whereas others were a complete mess where it took us a very long time to go through. And as I mentioned before, we had to exclude 3 sources because they vanished during our study. They closed down. And so again, when we think about restricted data and their value for research, there is a preservation concern if infrastructure isn't there to support the fact that these data sets can be around for the long term and accessible and usable for the long term. So keeping that in mind, we have thought about a few recommendations that we think could be pursued by groups like the Alliance, Canary, and the Tri-Agency to help improve the access and discovery of infrastructure for these types of restricted data sets. The first is that we think we should establish a community of practice for stewards of Canadian restricted data sources to help them establish commonly accepted guidelines and standards and receive training in that area. We also see the value in offering funding opportunities for restricted data sources to adapt discovery and access standards. One thing we were talking a lot about as we went through this was an amazing opportunity for graduate students to help undersourced restricted data sources to make their data more discoverable through metadata standards, for example. We also see value in aligning data request procedures as much as possible across jurisdictions to improve workflows for the acquisition of restricted data. And I know the Alliance is investigating this with the sensitive data pilot, and one of the members of our team, Victoria Smith, is working on that. And the other one, which I think is a bit more ambitious, but to explore a common infrastructure model that could be adopted by restricted data sources in Canada. So if there was a way for any data source in Canada that had restricted data to implement a similar infrastructure, whether it be an extension or a version of a website that you could source and structure data accordingly, this would help them develop a standard for doing so. The second key barrier that we identified really was, where is the metadata here? So finding data set descriptions, who was studied, the time frame it was studied, the access procedures were all extremely challenging and a huge barrier for us in this study. So this is also made increasingly frustrating because the grading that we did identified reasonably good descriptions of data description and data request processes. But unfortunately, none of them had metadata to sufficiently make them discoverable. So because of this, structured metadata didn't really have any existence here, specifically as it related to the data access request processes. And one of the challenges that we see here is that when you look at existing metadata schemas, the idea of access instructions is really limited to one field, for example, whether you're looking at Dublin Core, you're looking at schema.org. These are examples of potentially limited ability for researchers to sufficiently describe the access request process. And without metadata, we believe that these data sources are going to remain hard to find, and their data will not be accessible because of that. So two of our main recommendations in the metadata category is to develop a schema or an extension that addresses the access-specific data requirements to improve discovery of restricted data. And second, we think that we need to engage with data sources who are identified through our grading exercise to improve the discovery of their data in national aggregators. So again, that ranking list that I showed earlier, we think they would be excellent candidates to have their data structured using appropriate metadata and made more discoverable in these systems. And so one thing I wanted to mention is our group is actually pursuing this first recommendation already by extracting metadata from all of these data sources to try to identify a common standard that we could use to help people address the access requirements related to restricted data. And so just to give people a frame of mind for this, because I know it can get pretty in the weeds, I want you to just take this very hypothetical example where you come across a data set on the left-hand side, which is restricted in some way. And so you can identify what the data set's about, what are the data sources within it, what is the date range, but then in addition to that, you would actually be able to see the access criteria. What do I have to do as a researcher to access this data set? Am I eligible? What are the restrictions to it? Are there specific conditions of use that I need to follow? What would be the timeline for me to access it? For example, is it worth me taking the time to invest to apply for this data set if I know it's going to take 2 years to get? And finally, how much does it cost? So this is, again, just a simple hypothetical example, but this is what we envision as being applied to any restricted data set. There should be access level metadata that follows it everywhere as well. And then finally, the other barrier, which I think aligns well with some of the previous research that we've seen, is a general lack of documentation when it comes to these restricted data sets. So ultimately, we identified very little documentation across the health data sources we examined, and this mirrors the challenges identified in existing research. So we take all this time to find a data set that was already hard to find. We go through the rigorous process of accessing it, and then once we get it, it's not usable because it doesn't make any sense. So we do also see the challenge that many of these data sources that we identified are under-resourced and do not have the personnel or expertise to develop robust documentation in this area. There's really no devoted data stewardship support there. And so in terms of our recommendations, we think that we need to develop targeted guidance and training for the restricted data sources to articulate the value, importance, and utility of including documentation for restricted data. And we think the Alliance is really an ideal candidate for doing something like this. We also think that we can engage large organizations who have robust administrative staff who already are doing a good job with well-documented documented data, to provide guidance for those with less funding and capacity. So thinking of this more of a train the trainer model, where you have these really great, robust organizations who can provide support and guidance to those with less support going forward. So I just wanted to wrap up. It's a lot of information I just threw at you in the last 40 minutes. So just to give you some concluding thoughts and where we can go from there, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts about this, as well as some of the questions that you have. In terms of our group's next steps, we are going to be publishing our findings from this research so that it's available for everybody to see and access going forward. We're also progressing on phase 2 of our work to explore, discovery, and access metadata. Our first goal is to pull metadata from all 48 health data sources. This means not only metadata from the data set, but we're also pulling all of the different access requirements from each of these data sources to try to come up with a common standard and find commonalities across these elements. And hopefully the outcome of this will be a minimal standard for metadata that could be applied to both restricted data and the access procedures themselves. And so I want to leave you with just some thoughts in terms of discussion and questions for you going forward. I think based on the work that we've done here in trying our best to grade and evaluate a certain level of data sources, we think there's a lot of room for improvement with respect to discovery and access of restricted data. We think that high value data sets that can be used for research is an ideal opportunity here, but right now they're hidden, inaccessible, and or unusable. Metadata for restricted data and their access procedures can improve discovery and reuse, but it doesn't exist yet. And we're really only scratching the surface, right? So we only looked at 55 of these sources. There are still 82 other sources that remain in the social sciences and the humanities and engineering, in the hard sciences. And so there may be opportunities here to explore those as well, to see if what we identified in health sources may apply to other disciplines as well. And I think generally, our group believes that their support from national data initiatives is crucial for future success in this area. So support from the Alliance, from Canary, from the Tri-Agency, from DataCite Canada here are really essential in order to support the discovery of this data as we move forward to make sure that it's usable. So with that, I'll leave you with all of the references from the research that I talked about today. I highly recommend worth exploring it, these sources, if this is a topic of interest to you. And again, resources from our study right now, whether you're interested in exploring the grading rubric, it's available through the link here, as well as the data set, and the dataset inventory is available through the second link there. So with that, I will pause and happy to open it up to questions or comments. And I'd like to thank the Alliance for having me today, as well as the working group for all of the hard work they've been spending over the past year and a half, 2 years to do this work. So thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to any discussion we might have.
So much, Kevin. The chat has been busy.
Okay.
Yeah, we have some great questions there. I can scroll back up and read them out to you as you go, if that's helpful.
Sure.
Okay, so first question, are you also looking at international models such as the UK Health Innovation and Research Gateway?
That's interesting. So right now, in terms of models, that is not something we have looked at. What we were hoping to do once we were pulling all of these grading exercises and trying to extract all the metadata was to compare them to other standards that exist. So it's something on our radar, but the UK one that you've mentioned is not something that has been on our radar. So I will happily take that into consideration, and we will explore it and compare our work to that as well. So thank you. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you. Next question, how did you search and select which data repositories to include? They're saying there's a few they don't see on the list that Emily linked.
Yes, so one of the things and one of the limitations of our study was that we ultimately were looking at any data source we could find within a certain time frame that fit our criteria, being the access was limited in some way. So a data source that was Canadian, that required an application or request for data, or if a data source had relatively poor infrastructure. So when we went to the source, you might not get a description of the data, but maybe there were links to spreadsheets that you could download. So for certain government websites, for example, there were links to data, but we didn't know what the data was, and therefore we included it. So what we did was we explored to the best of our ability those, and then by querying CanLib data and the expert groups, we basically tried as best as we could to pull some. But I absolutely understand that we probably didn't grab all. And if you have others that you think we should be considering, please let us know and send them to us so that we can include them in future analysis. Because right now what we've done is just tried to the best we could to find what we could within the time that we had as a volunteer working group.
Thank you. Next question. um, Someone asking, how can we see the grade of the data sources? For instance, ISQ, MSSS in Quebec. Have you de-identified the data?
Yes, so the data set that you see on OSF right now is de-identified. And one of the reasons we had done that was because we didn't necessarily want to be finger wagging at these specific places or these repositories, saying you're doing a really bad job. That wasn't our intention. Our intention is not to shame the data sources we identified in our list. It was more to identify where those gaps were. So if you're interested in seeing the grading results, please email me directly and I'd be happy to share an identified copy with you. But just for the sake of public nature, we wanted to be sensitive to those sources that we were looking at, in the sense that we're trying to help and improve discovery and access, not necessarily make people feel bad for the fact that they might not be doing such a great job right now.
Thank you. Next question. A number of efforts in health have worked on digital access conditions over the last 10 years at the international level. GA4GH.org Duo, as well as IRC, machine, readable consent, and use conditions. I think that's a comment, not a question.
Yes, and so absolutely, and we are aware of those. And I think what we're trying to indicate here really is our focus is on the discovery side, right? And so all of the consent processes and the application processes in action is something we felt like was out of scope for our project. What we're hoping to do and what we're trying to accomplish here is that when you find a restricted data set online, there's additional metadata that would show you all the processes it would take you to go through that process. And so we didn't want to venture too deeply into that because, as you mentioned and highlighted, the fact that there are a lot of work going on internationally as well as within Canada right now. But we want to make sure that researchers at the very outset, whether they're reporting on it in a publication or they're finding it in a data source, they know right away whether or not they're eligible and what it would take to actually acquire a data set that is restricted of this kind. So a little bit of a distinction in where we're looking at this from, but I agree, this is a problem that has persisted and a lot of people are working on it. And I hope that there is more elegant and potentially streamlined solutions coming soon. But thank you for raising those questions.
We're still going here. They just keep coming.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, no, it's super. There's just a comment. This is excellent work and presentation. It is interesting to look at this in the context of FAIR principles. Much of the focus in some circles has been on the I and R, whereas this work identifies the challenges with the F and the A. Back to basics. Thank you all for your work.
Thank you.
And then the next question, is this initiative to develop a new standard being performed in an open, transparent way? Is there a versioning system set up and accepting contributions?
Interesting. So that's not something we had considered right now, but we are trying to make, as I've shown with some of the work that we're putting on OSF, we are trying to make that available and open as much as possible. And really what we're trying to do now in the stage we're at is we have a massive spreadsheet with all of the access requirements for all of those 48 data sources. And we have all of the metadata that we could find from the data sets in those 48 data sources. So discovery metadata, access metadata in a giant spreadsheet. And I think what we would like to do is once we start to identify those commonalities, we want to circulate them for comment and for feedback. And we usually do this through CanLib data. But if you are interested in participating or in seeing this further, please email us. We're not opposed to having other people involved in this project. And we do want to make it open and transparent so that it suits the needs of the Canadian community as it relates to restricted data. So please, thank you for your interest, and we would be happy to pursue that going forward.
Great, next question. I'm surprised there was so little from Quebec. Is there a reason for that? Also, do you see a relationship between licensing, example Creative Commons, and these access metadata standards you are describing? Like, could they be standardized to a similar extent, or do they vary too much?
So that's a great question. So in terms of the Quebec angle, we tried as best we could. Again, we had mostly English-speaking people on the group. We did release requests from the community to ask and identify more French resources and didn't hear back from the community. But again, if there are other French resources that you think we should pursue, we want to be inclusive. This was one of the limitations of our study, though, as we knew we weren't being as representative of the French angle as we would have liked. So again, if you have other sources that you think we should explore, please do. In terms of the standardization as it relates to licensing like Creative Commons or not, what we're seeing here is an immense amount of variability in terms of both the access and the discovery metadata we're finding in these restricted data sets. So for some access applications, for example, there are 5 fields in some data sources, and for others, there are 60. And so what we need to do is try to identify the most common baseline level that we think any data source could include, in the hopes that that would at least provide sufficient information to a researcher or a data requester so they can make the decision whether or not they want to pursue the data set based on their eligibility and the amount of lift it would take them to acquire the data. Thank you for your comments, though.
Next question. Are you also interested in looking more into the data access process, so delay, presential versus VPN, etc., and grade it for each data source?
So great question. And we try, based on the scope and the amount of time it took us to do the first part, we have not looked at that. We did originally test for contact information to see how long it would take people to respond to us, but we didn't necessarily want to be dishonest by fulfilling or putting effort into people who are already under-resourced to fulfill data requests that we wouldn't actually be using. And so we thought about that, but to go through the ethics approval and potentially trick data custodians to follow that application process for us, we decided against that procedure. I think it would be a really interesting project, but something that we decided not to pursue at this time.
Last question. Thus far. Oh, nope, there's another one. Okay, thanks for this presentation. The idea of national best practices is a good one. I was wondering if anyone knows about legal differences amongst the provinces for the sharing of restricted data and how it would affect licensing.
Yes, that's a great question. And they are very different, but I know what the sensitive data pilot is trying to do. And I don't know if Victoria is on the call. I haven't looked at the participant list, but they are trying to create more standardized processes with REBs to actually create a more standardized way across provinces in order to share sensitive data. I'm not going to speak to that eloquently or exactly, but I know that that is a challenge that they are trying to tackle through that pilot.
And thank you. Last question. Excellent work, excellent presentation. Resourcing data stewardship within projects is clearly a need, but developing national standards and best practices and tools are also so very important. While I recognize you talked about a UK source, I'm wondering if there are other countries that, at least for sensitive health data, are modeling the way.
Yeah, and so in terms of us looking at this, I think the UK has been one of in the forefront in the research that at least is reporting on the challenges with this. I think that's really where we're seeing a lot of the uptake in this area. However, I think one of the reasons we're doing this is it does feel a lot like uncharted territory, especially on the discovery side. So I think, again, there's a lot of work being done to streamline workflows for access and application, but there's not really anything we've been able to find around the discovery side. And so what I've been seeing my whole career and why I've been so interested in this topic is we have restricted data everywhere. Researchers have extreme challenges in figuring out whether they can access it. And why isn't there metadata out there that just simply describes how you actually acquire it? Like, why doesn't that exist? And so really for me, I've been looking and scanning the landscape forever, and I just don't see that happening. And that's what I think we're trying to achieve here, is some level of description that would allow someone to discern whether or not it's worth the effort for them to apply for a data set that may be restricted for some reason. Thanks
Another
everyone for the
question.
questions. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's super. Did you engage at all with the data providers to try to find out why they chose the access conditions they did?
So that I think would be something in the next phase of the project. Once we start to come up with common metadata, we did not engage with the data providers for this project. We were just looking at the surface level and trying to act as if we were a researcher trying to find and acquire a data set and what that process would look like. And so that's how we really approached the grading exercise of this work.
Follow up to that, did you try out processes to access some sources?
Yes, and so no, we did not, again, only because we didn't want to burden the data stewards of this data because we had no intention of using the data. So what we took again was the surface level, what's available on the site, how do I access it? Is there any documentation that helps me understand what this data is or not? And so just because we didn't want to burden people, we did not pursue it further than looking at it as if I was someone coming to the site with an interest in that data, trying to acquire it.
Awesome. Well, we have 6 minutes left. Um, yep, no
Okay.
new questions, just some comments. I actually have a question for you.
Sure.
As the new training specialist for the Alliance. Um, where do you think we are time-wise in terms of having access to the type of standards and curriculum where we could take that and then start, as you say, building a program to train trainers around how to create and manage this type of metadata?
It's a great question. I think we're a ways off, honestly, because I think we don't have a standard right now. And I think that's really why this Alliance group was formed, to try to come up with some best practices specifically around the discovery and access side. But I do think what the Alliance, for example, needs to do is start engaging with the custodians of these data sources to start letting them getting them to think about even providing metadata for their data set, which they could use. The further metadata, for example, would go a long way to improving the discovery of these data sets, so they could be indexed in aggregators and people could find them a lot more easily. The challenge there is that, again, without sufficient description for access, researchers are still going to fall into the same challenges, which is they find the data set they like, but they don't necessarily know how to get it, or they invest all the time into it, but don't realize that there's a long process ahead of them in order to do so. So I do think the conversation around discovery of data sets could start now, but the access piece, I think, is still potentially even a year off at this point.
Yep, excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, just some helpful links being added to the chat.
Great.
Um,
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for your interest and your questions. This project has been quite challenging and pretty massive, but it's been fun and exciting to work with so many great people on this project and to move this forward a little bit in terms of getting a better understanding of how we can support these sources and to improve the discovery of them overall. So I really appreciate your time and attention today.